On September 15, 1950, thousands of Allied soldiers charged ashore at the beaches of Inchon, a seemingly impossible mission to take one of the most heavily guarded ports in the world. Despite overwhelming odds, the attack succeeded, changing the tide of the Korean War forever. And one global conflict where superpowers faced off with massive armies and navies in large-scale engagements. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or DPRK, in the north, and the Republic of Korea, or ROK, in the south. Your support helps us make more of the episodes that you love. This quote couldn't be more apt than for General MacArthur, who despite losing hundreds of lives tried every possible option to trap the North Korean army. To understand MacArthur's strategy, let's take a closer look at the Korean peninsula itself. If the North Korean army continued to push south, there would be no chance of stopping them. For this, the U.S. Navy set up a blockade around the coast of the peninsula. The capture of Inchon opened up the entire northern half of the peninsula to attack. It was essentially a proxy war between the United States and the Soviet Union, but the lessons learned from the Battle of Inchon continue to shape the world we live in today. If you did, please support us so we can keep bringing you these amazing stories. Thanks for watching. The battle was a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, courage and determination can prevail. It was a testament to the power of military planning and execution, and it was a harbinger of the challenges that lay ahead in the Cold War. The Soviets had hoped that by supporting the North Koreans, they could force the Americans to abandon their position in East Asia, but the Battle of Inchon proved to be the turning point of the war. Not only did it prevent the North Koreans from taking over the South, but it also forced the Soviets to recognize the strength of their new adversary. The Americans had shown that they were willing to fight and die to contain communism. And this realization would have a profound impact on the future of the Cold War. The Allies pursued the retreating enemy, driving them back all the way to the Yellow River. By the end of October, the war was effectively over. The North Korean army was defeated and the Republic of Korea had been secured. This prevented supplies from reaching the northern half and gave the Navy control of the seas. Once the Navy had gained control, the Air Force started dropping bombs on Inchon's airfields and military bases. This destroyed the enemy's ability to mount an effective defense. With the airfields and military bases destroyed, it was time for the ground assault. The first wave of attacks was on September 15, 1950. This was led by the U.S. 1st Marine Division and the South Korean 6th Division. They attacked from the west, taking the enemy by surprise and causing heavy casualties. Meanwhile, another South Korean division attacked from the east. These attacks were supported by tanks, artillery, and airstrikes. Despite fierce resistance, the Allies managed to make some progress. By nightfall, they had taken the airport and pushed northwards up the Han River Valley. The following day, the battle continued with the Allies making further gains. On September 17th, the North Korean commander realized that the situation was hopeless and ordered a retreat. The Allies followed up their attack, driving the enemy back to the Yellow River. By September 20th, the battle was over. The Allies had captured Inchon, and the North Korean army was in full retreat. The only hope lay in a daring attack on a city that seemed almost impossible to take. The northern half was backed by the Soviet Union and China, while the southern half enjoyed the support of the United Nations, particularly the United States. The Northern Army was well-equipped and trained and had access to heavy firepower. They pushed the poorly equipped and smaller Southern Army towards the southeastern corner of the peninsula. At this point, the Northern Army was close to winning the war. All they needed to do was push the remaining Southern troops into the sea. But here's where the story takes an interesting twist. There was a small strip of land just above the northern border known as the Jomchon area. If MacArthur could somehow capture this small strip of land, he could cut off supplies to the northern half and potentially win the war. However, the main problem with attacking from the south was that the Northern Army was way too powerful. Any attack would be met with heavy fire and likely end in an embarrassing defeat. So MacArthur devised a bold new plan. He wanted to take Inchon, a heavily guarded port city located just north of Seoul. Taking the city would require a large number of troops and a lot of firepower. It was a dangerous plan, but it may have been the only chance of winning the war. Each state claimed to be the true government of all of Korea. The battle lasted for 2 weeks with fierce fighting taking place all across the city. As we said earlier, the attacking force was made up of mainly US soldiers, although many other nations contributed to the final victory. In total, over 7,000 American soldiers took part in the battle. Of these, almost 2,000 were killed, wounded, or missing in action. But the real reason for this division was the rivalry between the two superpowers who occupied the region after Japan's defeat in World War II. The Soviet Union backed the North and the United States backed the South. Tensions were high, and inevitably on June 1950, the Northern Army crossed the 38th parallel and began pushing southward. Over the next few weeks, they advanced 60 miles towards the port city of Pusan in the southeast corner of South Korea. The North Koreans seemed unstoppable, and many believed that the southern half of the country would soon fall completely. This is when United Nations Commander General Douglas MacArthur came up with a daring plan to turn the tide of the war. But this is only part of the story. The wars of the 20th century were mostly fought not between the great powers themselves, but through smaller conflicts where local proxies battled each other under the watchful gaze of superpowers like the United States and the Soviet Union. One such conflict was the Korean War, but why did it happen? How did a handful of soldiers pull off one of the most audacious feats of the 20th century? And what does their victory tell us about the nature of war today? Now, when we think of major wars in the 20th century, we often focus onto world wars. By 1950, the Korean Peninsula had been divided into two separate states since the end of World War II. Before we get into MacArthur's brilliant strategy, if you're enjoying this episode, please consider supporting the channel. There are some who say opportunity is created, not found. The Battle of Inchon is considered one of the most successful amphibious assaults in history, but that doesn't mean it was easy. You might be wondering, why did the US decide to take the risk? Well, the answer is simple: they were desperate. So what actually happened at the Battle of Inchon? Well, the first step was to gain control of the sea. The Battle of Inchon was a decisive victory for the Allies, and it changed the course of the war. But the story doesn't end there. You see, the Korean War wasn't just a conflict between two Koreas. Today, the legacy of the Korean War lives on in the demilitarized zone that separates North and South Korea. In September 1950, United Nations forces led by U.S. General Douglas MacArthur executed one of the most daring amphibious assaults in history. They chose as their target the seemingly impregnable port of Inchon, located behind the lines of the advancing North Korean army, which threatened to occupy the entire Korean peninsula. But its significance transcended the realm of tactical brilliance. When World War II ended in 1945, Korea found itself at a crossroads. Both the Soviet Union and the United States were determined to secure their respective zones of control in Korea. Tensions escalated, leading to a series of violent clashes along the border. Task Force Smith consisted of approximately 5,000 U.S. Marines and soldiers from other UN nations. Their mission was nothing short of audacious. They were to seize Inchon and disrupt the North Korean supply lines, effectively ending their southward advance. On September 15, 1950, Task Force Smith landed at Inchon. It was seen as a pivotal moment that showcased the strength and resolve of the United Nations and its commitment to containing communism. The successful execution of such a complex operation bolstered the image of the United States and its allies as formidable forces to be reckoned with. Conversely, the North Korean leadership faced growing criticism from the international community. The failure to defend against the amphibious assault raised concerns about the competence of their military strategy and leadership, leading to increased scrutiny and diplomatic isolation. What followed was a display of military precision and courage. It established a precedent for limited yet decisive military intervention in regions deemed crucial to the balance of power. The success of the operation demonstrated that even in the shadow of nuclear deterrence, conventional military actions could yield significant results. This precedent would serve as a model for future interventions during the Cold War, particularly in conflicts like Vietnam and Afghanistan. The Inchon Landing stands as a monumental event in the annals of the Cold War, its impact resonating far beyond the Korean Peninsula. It was a pivotal moment that reshaped the global balance of power and set the stage for a new era of proxy conflicts. The audacious plan to capture Inchon executed by U.S. General Douglas MacArthur not only reversed the tide of the Korean War, but also provided a blueprint for future interventions during the Cold War. The landing's success had profound implications for the international stage, intensifying the rivalry between the Western and Eastern blocs and establishing a precedent for limited yet decisive military actions in the pursuit of strategic objectives. Moreover, the victory at Inchon highlighted the growing importance of air and naval superiority in modern warfare, a lesson that would be carried forward in subsequent conflicts. The echoes of Inchon can be heard in the jungles of Vietnam, the battlefields of Afghanistan, and various proxy wars that defined the latter half of the 20th century. The Inchon Landing was a turning point, a decisive moment that forever altered the course of the Cold War and left an enduring legacy on the global balance of power. The landing was swift and decisive, catching the North Korean defenders off guard. The UN troops moved inland, encountering fierce resistance, but they pressed on. Within days, they had secured vital bridges and roads leading to Inchon City. By September 28th, Inchon was in UN hands. The situation remained volatile as both sides amassed troops and engaged in frequent skirmishes. It was a powder keg waiting to explode. The capture of Inchon had several profound consequences that reverberated throughout the Korean Peninsula and beyond. The daring amphibious assault and subsequent victory was a testament to the skill and bravery of the UN and South Korean troops. It demonstrated that the tide of the war could indeed turn and instilled confidence in the face of adversity. Meanwhile, the North Korean troops suffered a significant blow to their morale. The loss of Inchon, a vital strategic point, shook their belief in the invincibility of their army and raised questions about their ability to resist the combined forces of the United Nations. This demoralizing defeat had lasting implications on the conduct of the war and the determination of the North Korean leadership. Firstly, the landing dealt a devastating blow to North Korean logistics. By seizing Inchon, a major supply hub, the UN forces effectively cut off the flow of reinforcements and vital resources to the North Korean troops in the south. This move trapped thousands of North Korean soldiers who found themselves isolated from their supply bases and support. With their lines of communication severed, these trapped troops were vulnerable and their fighting capabilities diminished. As a result, the momentum of the war shifted dramatically. The once unstoppable North Korean advance ground to a halt, and the UN and South Korean forces were able to regroup and launch a counteroffensive. The outbreak of hostilities occurred on June 1950 when North Korean troops with Soviet backing crossed the 38th parallel and began their invasion of the South. As North Korean troops advanced, it seemed as though the entire peninsula would fall under communist rule. South Korea's army was ill-prepared and quickly fell back before the advancing enemy. Within a matter of weeks, the North Korean troops were on the outskirts of Seoul, the capital city. The UN Security Council condemned the aggression, but the Soviet Union, as a permanent member, consistently blocked any meaningful response. This deadlock underscored the limitations of the UN in addressing the conflict. Faced with mounting pressure, the United States, under President Truman, made the decision to intervene militarily in Korea. It was a pivotal moment that marked the beginning of the Korean War. For centuries, the Korean Peninsula had been under the dominion of Japanese imperialism, enduring the oppressive rule of its colonial master. They were on the defensive, struggling to contain the North Korean advance. The situation appeared bleak as the North Korean troops closed in on Seoul. However, amidst this grim landscape, a bold plan was hatched that would change the tide of the war forever: the Inchon Landing. The mastermind behind this audacious plan was U.S. General Douglas MacArthur. He recognized that a direct assault on the North Korean troops from the front would be costly and might not succeed. Instead, he conceived an amphibious assault on Inchon, a key North Korean supply base located behind enemy lines. It was a risky strategy, but MacArthur believed that the element of surprise and the strategic value of capturing Inchon outweighed the risks. However, with Japan's defeat in the war, the future of Korea emerged as a pressing question on the international stage. The victorious allies, the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union and China, convened at the Potsdam Conference in July 1945 to discuss the post-war order in Asia. Korea's status was a point of contention among these formidable powers. Despite its strategic importance, Korea was not a significant player in the global political arena. Consequently, the three victorious powers decided to temporarily divide the peninsula along the 38th parallel, with the Soviet Union administering the north and the United States overseeing the south. This division was intended to be no more than a stopgap measure pending a formal agreement on the peninsular's future. However, it soon became apparent that the Cold War rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States was intensifying, and any compromise seemed increasingly elusive. It served as a pivotal event that fundamentally reshaped the global balance of power during a period of intense ideological struggle between the Western and Eastern blocs. The Korean peninsula thus transformed into a crucible where the fate of empires were forged and proxy conflicts became the new battleground of the Cold War. What followed was a lightning strike of unprecedented audacity. By seizing the port so swiftly and unexpectedly, UN forces cut off North Korean supply lines, trapping thousands of enemy troops and causing the collapse of their advance southward. It was a decisive moment that completely altered the course of the war and profoundly influenced the nature of proxy conflicts throughout the Cold War. The Inchon Landing, as it came to be known, is celebrated as a triumph of military planning and execution. To understand the magnitude of the Inchon Landing, it's crucial to delve into the historical context that led up to this pivotal moment. As the Cold War intensified, each side sought to expand its sphere of influence in the post-war world. The early stages of the war did not bode well for the UN and South Korean forces. Inchon was heavily fortified and considered virtually impregnable. To execute this daring plan, MacArthur assembled a task force under the command of Major General Robert Sampson. The significance of the Inchon Landing cannot be overstated. It was a resounding victory that shattered the North Korean war effort. Secondly, the Inchon Landing had a profound impact on the morale of both sides. Moreover, the Inchon Landing played a crucial role in shaping the international perception of the conflict. Finally, the Inchon Landing had far-reaching implications for the future of the Cold War. Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode. Today we're going to be talking about the Inchon Landings. And if you know anything about that, you will know that it was a brilliant move, but it was also very, very risky. So just to bring people up to speed, what we be talking about is a huge amphibious landing by United Nations forces in September 1950. At that point, the North Koreans had almost won the war. They pushed the UN and South Korean forces back into a small corner of the southeast of the Korean peninsula. For example, they reported that the North Korean troops usually left their posts at night, which meant that there was no guard duty during the hours of darkness. They also reported that there was a lot of barbed wire around the area, which was actually cut down by the North Koreans at night, which again took away a line of defense. And they also reported that the coastal artillery was manned by young conscripts who were not very well trained. All of this information was gathered by these brave men and women who put themselves on the line, and again, this turned out to be true. The hills around the landing beaches were very steep, and it's easy to look at it in hindsight and say, oh, It was obvious that the North Koreans weren't expecting an attack here because they were focusing on other areas. But that's easy to say now. At the time, there was no guarantee that it would work. But the leadership of both the UN and the ROC, they had a lot of intelligence pointing towards that conclusion. And there were valleys between them, which meant that it was very difficult to get artillery up there. They provided the data that was required, and in the end, it was a resounding success. Huge ships sailing into a little-known harbor, hoping that they would arrive at high tide and not get stuck on the bottom of the sea. If so, please do leave me a comment and tell me what you thought. Thank you very much. Troops landing in an area which could be defended, in fact, was defended by coastal artillery, and they hoped that the North Koreans wouldn't spot them until it was too late. It's easy to see why there was so much anxiety about this operation, and the North Koreans had taken advantage of this by putting their guns in those valleys, where they could blast anything which came ashore. These days, before any kind of major operation, there's always a reconnaissance element, which goes in first to check the situation. And it's easy for us to look back now and say, well, they had all the intelligence they needed, but that wasn't necessarily so. And there were points along the way where they could have decided that it wasn't worth the risk. There were points where they could have said, well, let's try and do this another way, or let's wait until we have more information. But General MacArthur and his fellow commanders, they pressed ahead. And in the end, it was a brilliant success. But in this case, they couldn't do that because it was a complete surprise. The whole point of it was that the North Koreans needed to be kept in the dark. But because of the Korean intelligence, the UN commanders knew this in advance and they took steps to counter it. And this intelligence was passed through to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Seoul, and all seemed lost. But when UN Command decided to launch an amphibious landing behind enemy lines, they hoped to cut off the North Korean supply lines, which they did. In some places, there were pillboxes and trenches and minefields. In other places, there was nothing. So this gave the commanders an idea of where they might expect resistance and where it might be lighter. Another thing that the Korean spies reported was that the ferries across the Han River from Seoul had been destroyed, and this intelligence proved to be vital. You see, the plan was that once the bridgeheads were established at Inchon, then the 1st Cavalry Division would cross over the Han River and advance northwards towards Seoul, but since the bridges had been destroyed, that would have been impossible. But thanks to this information, they knew that, okay, that part of the plan wouldn't work, and they needed to find a way to ferry the troops across the river, and they went on to win a great victory. They didn't know it was going on until several hours after it began. As it happens, there was only one division, the 8th Army, and it was spread out along the whole front line. If the spy had reported that there were 3 divisions instead of 2, then the UN commander might have thought that there would be stronger defenses and he might have decided not to go ahead with the landing. So even small pieces of intelligence like that, which may seem insignificant, they can actually make a big difference. This suggests that the ROC intelligence agents had done their job well and the North Koreans had no inkling that anything was about to happen. In fact, there's an argument that if the intelligence had been wrong or even slightly off, then it could have gone very badly indeed for the United Nations forces. It has very extreme tides and there were fears that the ships could get stranded if they went in at low tide. There were also fears that the North Koreans would defend this position, which they did, and that the UN landing parties would be annihilated. But in spite of that, it went ahead and it worked brilliantly. So we're going to take a look at what intelligence made this possible. So today, we are going to talk about the intelligence which made this thing possible and why it was so important. And in fact, I would argue that without the South Korean intelligence, this simply wouldn't have happened. Now, I am not trying to downplay the efforts of the US intelligence agencies and the analysts and all the work that they did. Of course, that was very important. But what I am saying is that we should remember that the Korean Military Intelligence Agency, later called the KCIA, they also contributed. And of course, they had a particular advantage because they had lots of spies and resistance fighters inside North Korea who were able to send information out about what was going on behind enemy lines. Now, I've spoken about the Inchon landings before, and I do appreciate that not everyone is going to be an expert on the Korean War. However, this was a very dangerous plan because Inchon is a very strange harbor. I think most people tend to focus on the UN side of things, but the South Koreans had good intelligence too. In fact, those operatives provided local intelligence that was vital to the success of the operation. They also provided information on the type of defenses the North Koreans had put up. There was also a psychological aspect to this. When the landings began, the North Korean leadership was completely in the dark about what was happening. On top of that, the Korean agents were able to report that there were two divisions stationed in the vicinity of Inchon, which turned out to be true, but there were much fewer troops than they expected. Another thing that the Koreans reported was that the topography of the area was such that it was hard to bring artillery to bear on the beaches. The Inchon operation was daring and audacious, and it involved a huge risk. We can't imagine how complicated something like this must have been. And it's interesting, isn't it, that this sort of thing doesn't really happen anymore. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that this was a very, very risky operation. It seems that the intelligence agencies, both the UN and the ROC, they did everything that was necessary. Anyway, that's it for this episode. I hope you found it interesting. I hope you learned something new. The Inchon Amphibious Assault, a high-stakes gamble during the Korean War on September 15, 1950, the tide of the Korean War took an unexpected turn with the Inchon Amphibious Assault. Led by United Nations forces under the strategic vision of American General Douglas MacArthur, this daring operation on the west coast of Korea marked a pivotal moment in the conflict. Despite being audacious and dangerous, the Inchon landing succeeded, pushing back the North Korean People's Army and transforming the trajectory of the war. But what made this operation so risky, and why was it considered such a high-stakes gamble? Let's find out in today's episode. Geographical and environmental challenges. Amphibious assaults are inherently risky, requiring precise coordination between naval, air, and ground forces. The success of such operations hinges on achieving complete surprise, as any forewarning would allow the enemy to reinforce defenses or repel the invasion. Assembling a large armada of ships, landing craft, and supplies under tight secrecy was a daunting task. Any breach in operational security could have alerted North Korean forces, allowing them to prepare defenses or launch preemptive strikes against the fleet. By mid-1950, the Korean War had reached a critical juncture. The North Korean advance had nearly overrun the entire peninsula, and the survival of South Korea as an independent state hung in the balance. The North Korean command, confident that the rugged terrain and tidal conditions made an amphibious assault impossible, had left the area lightly defended. When the UN forces stormed the beaches on September 15, 1950, they achieved complete tactical surprise. The rapid capture of Inchon and the subsequent advance towards Seoul severed North Korean supply lines, forcing the NKPA into a disorganized retreat. However, this same element of surprise that contributed to the landing's success also underscored the inherent dangers of the operation. The UN forces had gambled that the North Koreans would not anticipate an attack in this location. But if the NKPA had been prepared for an amphibious assault, the outcome could have been disastrous. A well-placed artillery barrage or a strong defensive posture could have repelled the landing party, leading to heavy casualties or even forcing the retreat of UN forces. In such a scenario, the North Koreans could have used the captured UN landing craft to reinforce their positions, further strengthening their defenses against any follow-up attacks. This highlights the precarious balance between risk and reward that characterized the Inchon landing. The UN forces had taken advantage of the North Koreans' lack of preparedness to achieve surprise. But had the roles been reversed, the consequences for the UN could have been severe. UN and South Korean forces were on the brink of collapse, and a perception of imminent defeat was setting in. A failed amphibious assault at Inchon would not only result in heavy casualties, but would also deal a devastating blow to the morale of UN forces and embolden the communist bloc. It was a masterful display of military strategy and execution, but it was also a daring risk that could have ended in disaster. General MacArthur's gamble was a testament to his audacious nature and his belief in the power of bold maneuvers. However, it was also a risky move that challenged conventional military wisdom and pushed the limits of what was considered possible at the time. The combination of geographical, military, logistical, political, and psychological factors made the Inchon Landing a precarious undertaking. Yet despite the odds, the operation succeeded, transforming the tide of the Korean War and cementing MacArthur's legacy as one of history's most brilliant military strategists. Nevertheless, the Inchon Landing also serves as a reminder of the fine line between triumph and catastrophe in warfare, and the importance of carefully weighing the risks and benefits of any military operation. On the other hand, a successful operation could revitalize flagging spirits and renew determination to push back the North Koreans. The stakes were so high that even if the landing had a chance of success, however slim, it was worth the risk. MacArthur understood that he had only one shot at pulling off this risky operation. If it failed, it could lead to a communist takeover of South Korea and potentially spark a broader conflict with China and Russia. This made the Inchon Landing a high-stakes gamble, one that could either turn the tide of the war or result in a disastrous defeat. MacArthur's reputation as a military leader was deeply tied to the success of the operation. Had it failed, it would have likely led to his dismissal and a re-evaluation of U.S. strategy in Korea, possibly prolonging the conflict or even resulting in a communist victory. The timing of the operation had to be precise to ensure that the landing was not compromised. Furthermore, once the landing was underway, maintaining supply lines to support the advancing troops would be difficult. The UN forces would need to quickly secure the area around Inchon to prevent any interference from North Korean forces attempting to disrupt supply runs. The limited port facilities at Inchon meant that the initial waves of troops would have to act quickly to establish supply routes or risk being stranded without essential resources. Any delay could allow the North Korean army to regroup, counterattack, and potentially encircle the invading forces. Additionally, the UN forces had to contend with the possibility of bad weather, which could disrupt both the landing and the subsequent supply runs. Storms or high winds could cause delays or even force a postponement of the operation, providing the North Koreans with valuable time to prepare defenses or launch attacks elsewhere. MacArthur's plan relied on the assumption that the North Korean People's Army would not anticipate an attack at Inchon due to the perceived difficulties of the terrain. At the time of the planning, North Korean troops were pressing hard against UN and South Korean forces in the east, and most military advisors believed that the next major engagement would occur there. This led many within the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff and even MacArthur's own subordinates to express strong reservations about the operation, arguing that valuable resources would be diverted away from the main theater of operations, leaving the troops around Pusan vulnerable. They feared that the Inchon Landing could either fail or succeed only after costly battles, thereby disrupting the UN's overall battle plan. Even if the landing party succeeded in establishing a beachhead, questions remained about their ability to advance inland. The terrain further north was mountainous, which could hinder troop movements and provide cover for the North Korean forces to regroup and counterattack. Moreover, if the North Koreans successfully defended their positions along the coast, the UN forces risked being trapped in a small salient without secure supply lines. This could lead to a situation where the invading force would be cut off from reinforcements and forced to surrender or be annihilated. And finally, the Inchon Landing was primarily a strike against coastal fortifications and would not address the core strengths of the North Korean military. The bulk of the NKPA's combat power lay in its mobile infantry divisions further inland. Therefore, Capturing Inchon alone might not significantly weaken the North Korean forces and could leave other areas of the front line less defended. One of the primary reasons the Inchon landing was deemed risky was the formidable natural obstacles presented by the geography of the region. Inchon's harbor was infamous for its extreme tidal variations, some of the highest in the world. The water level here could rise and fall by as much as 32 feet, which created a narrow window for landing craft to come ashore. As the water receded, it would leave vast areas of mudflat that could trap any vessels not timed precisely with the tide. The landing had to be meticulously planned to coincide with high tide, giving only a few hours for troops and equipment to be unloaded before the water retreated once more. Adding to the complexity, the approach to Inchon was through a winding and narrow channel, leaving naval forces vulnerable to enemy mines and artillery. The harbor's natural defenses meant that any miscalculation in timing or navigation could result in catastrophic losses even before the assault began. Although the North Korean forces were not heavily fortified in Inchon at the time, they still could have exploited these geographical challenges to mount a devastating defense if they had anticipated the landing. This added an element of unpredictability to the operation, as any unforeseen circumstances, like adverse weather or mechanical failures, could compromise the element of surprise and alert the enemy. Military and strategic uncertainties beyond the environmental hazards. The strategic gamble of the Inchon landing lay in its operational complexity. Logistical and supply difficulties. Another critical factor contributing to the risk of the Inchon operation was the immense logistical challenge it posed. Political and psychological stakes. The Inchon landing carried immense political and psychological stakes, which heightened the risk associated with the operation. The element of surprise and its consequences. Despite the overwhelming risks, the Inchon landing ultimately succeeded because of the element of surprise. Conclusion. In conclusion, the Inchon amphibious assault during the Korean War was a high-stakes gamble that paid off, but only just barely. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more updates on all our videos.